Voice check. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. We need really good voices for this if it's an audiobook.
Oh my God.
We need to use our audiobook voice, narrator voice.
And then we did a sound check.
Yeah. June is audiobook month, and I only recently became a convert, but you were talking about them for a long time before I even ever started an audiobook ever. I was always a print reader.
Yeah. What made you decide to give it a shot?
Well, I recently became a convert. Usually I would only listen to audiobooks during the wintertime when I knew I was going to be in my car more often than usual.
Oh, okay.
But a reason I became an audiobook reader lately is because I'm now in this book club that the library does at the Ferndale Project. And so now that I have to be forcing myself to read a book literally every 30 days, which I can be a slow reader, now someone else is reading for me.
There you go. I've always been a slow reader too, so it was sort of natural for me to come to them. In preparation for this podcast, I started thinking back, and I can't remember a specific, I'm going to start reading audiobooks moment, but I do remember kind of having the sense of realizing that I hadn't read a book in over a year. And I worked in a library for my entire adult life and some of my teenage life, and that feels very shameful to tell your colleagues or patrons, I don't read much. They wonder why you work at a library.
Quote unquote read because you are still reading technically.
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
Is a thing we'll totally get into.
Yeah.
You're listening to A Little Too Quiet, the Ferndale Library podcast. It's brought to you by the Friends of the Ferndale Library, and we're talking all about audiobooks because it's audiobook month. And I'm Jeff, and I'm joined here by Kelly.
Hello.
Who was the one who really inspired me to start listening to audiobooks.
Oh, wonderful. Glad to hear it. It's weird to have been doing it for a long time because, like you say, quote unquote read, I've found recently that people aren't doing that anymore. People aren't going, oh, well, I didn't actually read it, I listened to it, or accusing other people of not reading. And I think a lot of that has to do with just the way people are living their lives. One of the things I was thinking about when you asked me is, the way they fit into our lives and how I have mixed feelings about it, because I think with this country's obsession with efficiency, that sitting down and reading a book doesn't always fit into people's plans. And that is sad in a way for me, but also as a person who just didn't do that, I thought, well, we do still have we're still trying to make space for stories, for entertainment, for different kinds of learning than maybe, from school or even for work, is that it's good because maybe people would just not be reading at all.
Right.
So, and I think another thing that's bringing it to the fore is Audible is an amazing app. I've been a member there for a very long time, off and on. And then sort of the development of the library apps, Libby/Overdrive and Hoopla, you can really build yourself up a queue of books and just kind of, I always get overambitious and then the holds expire and I get sad and disappointed with myself. But, the ability to have them on your phone, I think, has really changed people's access to them. I'm a person who has been doing it long enough that I would check out CDs from this library and you'd have to make sure that they weren't all scratched. You had to make sure they were there. And then when MP3 players came along, I would check out CDs, rip them, organize them by title. I mean, if you were a music listener, it's the similar thing. And then load them on, painstakingly onto your weird MP3 player. I never had an iPod, but so the idea that you could pull your phone out of your pocket, search for a title, click download, and just listen, it still kind of astounds me because I remember the days of doing that. Or if you were a little into the gray internet marketplace, searching for places, for this book that you couldn't find on audiobook at your library. They used to have abridged audiobooks because they were on tapes and there'd be so many tapes. And that was a pet peeve of mine. Why would I ever want to listen to less than the whole book?
Right.
That's dumb. So now they don't do that anymore because it's all on, it's all digital. Yeah.
As you saw hinted at in the title of this episode, we're not only are we talking about audiobooks, but later in the episode, we will be joined by a professional audiobook narrator, Dan John Miller, who happens to be based here in Michigan, which is why we're getting him on our Michigan-based podcast. But he's also a musician who's been in bands such as Blanche and has been in films such as Walk the Line. But he's also been narrating tons and tons of books, including, I'm seeing right here, a perfect fit for him, the nonfiction book about the Wrecking Crew,
That's cool.
Band of session musicians that you hear. They created the Wall of Sound. Anyway, we'll be talking to Dan in a little while.
That's awesome.
But I want to say a different name to Kelly right now, and that's Jim Dale.
Oh, yeah.
My first introduction to the world of audiobooks was like sometime in like 2001 when a family member had an audiobook downloaded on iTunes, and it was one of the Harry Potters.
Yeah.
And the concept of me as like a teenager sitting still and listening to a book. Look at this. There's so many tracks. What is all this? It was a foreign concept to me.
He's wonderful.
But he's a legend now.
Yeah. I actually saw him in a production of Three Penny Opera that also had Alan Cumming. It was at Studio 54. It was just an awesome show. But he's a great actor.
Jim Dale is the narrator of all the audiobooks of the Harry Potter series for American audiences, and then I believe the British audiences.
It's Stephen Fry.
Had Stephen Fry doing all the books.
That's my favorite.
Yeah.
I, again, not going to incriminate myself, but there was a time when you could not get a hold of those in a legal way, and I managed to read them, and they're both awesome. Yeah. I happen to have been a fan of Stephen Fry's first, so I wanted to hear it. But yeah, Jim Dale also narrated The Night Circus.
Oh, cool.
Which is a perfect choice for him. When you have those big series, somebody with a malleable voice is really important. I listened to Game of Thrones, which I can't remember the guy's name that narrates it, but he'd been doing it a really long time, older guy. And he really made listening to that book like way easier than you would think, because he had different voices for a lot of these people. Oh yeah, Roy Dotrice.
And he's even dressed in a Game of Thrones costume online. Great.
Yeah, and we've talked about this book before, that one that I had to give up, There's Too Many Family Members.
Oh, Galore by Michael Crummy. Yep.
I couldn't do it because you clearly have to have the family map in front of you to understand what's happening. And I was like, it sounds cool, but I'm not going to be able to handle it on audio.
What are some of the books you've got on your list and your notes here?
I really, really, really enjoyed It by Stephen King, narrated by Steven Weber.
Oh, man.
Who was, if you're an old person like me, he was on Wings, that show Wings.
Oh, yeah.
He's also been in a production of The Stand. Like, it was a TV production that some people like better than,
I've
other
heard good
productions.
things about that.
Man, I loved that book. There was so many times I just like sat in my driveway, like finishing it up. He brought the nostalgic part of it to light, and the scary stuff. He really leaned into it. And that is a brick of a book. It's huge. Like, that's 40 hours of audio. So if it's not well done, you're like, who cares?
Right.
But he does a perfect job with it. Another standout would be The Fireman by Joe Hill, narrated by Kate Mulgrew. Captain Janeway.
That's
for
amazing.
All of you Star Trek. Oh my God, her voice is so perfect for it. And what's like, the main characters, I believe, are men. Mm-hmm. And so often they will have, they'll try to match the gender or whatever, but it doesn't matter, man. She like made the scary stuff in that book like really scary. She just seems unflappable. So you're like, she feels like this observer that's watching all this and telling you about it. Yeah, man, I couldn't recommend that one enough. It's so good.
I can only imagine she's got such she's got range. Her voice can go very low.
Yeah. And
can get kind of smoky and raspy. Mm-hmm. It's great.
Yeah. And it wasn't like too much, because a lot of people, I'm sure, with very distinctive voices, you're like, okay, I'm listening for 30 hours. It's too much. But yeah, I just couldn't get enough of that one.
It's probably why Michael Caine doesn't do audiobooks. I can only imagine.
And here's kind of a lesser known one that I want to shout out. It's called the Marid Audran series. The author is George Alec Effinger, and it's narrated by a guy named Jonathan Davis. And it's a cyberpunk series that's set in like the Arab world, which is, I've never heard of anything else like that. And it's got lots of scenes of violence in it and weird cybernetic stuff.
Nice.
But this guy, Jonathan Davis, gets like, he clearly can pronounce Arabic. I don't know if he speaks Arabic, and gets the kind of the cadence. My significant other is Lebanese. And so we read these books together, and he's like, oh, they get like that, like honorific stuff. There's all these greetings you kind of have to do. And even in this cyberpunk world, that's like brought to it. And he just gets that right. The names sort of roll off his tongue. And I love that series. They're like really unique to me and just transport you to a place that doesn't truly exist, but there's elements of a world that maybe we don't know so much about.
That's a whole other thing to consider, is the pronunciations. That's also a meme you see on the internet, that someone reading print will try on their own, but the audiobook reader always knows the correct pronunciations of everything.
Yes, exactly. You do feel very smart when you're at like a book club, meeting, and you're saying everybody's names right.
And that's something interesting. We just reminded me, we read The Gold Diggers by Sanjana Sathian, and I listened to it on audiobook narrated by Rama Valluri. And it's about second generation Indians here they're living in Georgia actually, but their parents came over from India. One of the characters is, when the author has done interviews, has said this character's name is Anita, but the narrator says Anita.
Oh.
I don't know where to go. Anyway, so
don't disagree,
that's
guys.
Just the nuance.
You're complicating things. Yeah, I think another weird phenomenon of listening to audiobooks is that, especially, I found out early in my life that I'm kind of an auditory learner, and so like little phrases and stuff will stick in my head. So like the Game of Thrones character names in particular, they have a little melody of their own, and so you get like these names stuck in your head, which is kind of a weird thing, or little phrases sometimes. And then the other phenomenon I've had, if I'm listening to a book and I stop and then I get back in my car and I rewind it, when they're saying the words, I'll remember where I was in my car when that comes up. I'll be like, oh yeah, I was turning, onto Woodward when that was. And it's not like a big, like blast you in your face kind of a moment, but it just is like recalls where you were, which, doesn't really happen when you're sitting in a chair reading a book.
You've been bringing up fiction. I want to say, and I don't know if this is going to work for anybody else, but if you're out there and you're thinking, I want to get into audiobooks, but I just can't yet, you might want to consider nonfiction, because you can almost trick your brain into thinking that you're listening to a long form podcast.
Yes, there you go.
And one that really worked for me, the narrator was Scott Brick, and the book Kelly will know very well is The Devil in the White City.
I also listened to that book. Which was
like my first I am in love with audiobooks kind of moment.
Yeah.
Which is about like Jack the Ripper in Chicago 1890s World Fair.
Wild story.
Jack the Ripper meets the demon barber situation.
It's a really wild story. It's a really complicated story.
Yeah.
And a lot of times audiobooks can't pull that off, but Scott Brick brought that story to life. Erik Larson, the structure of that story worked really well. And I speaking of the previous phenomenon, I used to walk up 9 Mile for exercise at lunch, and I have a very significant memory of walking in downtown Ferndale, listening to one of the like more brutal moments of that book. It just
That's the thing, is we get our memories tied to where we were in the book. Another one, I don't want to get like religious or anything, but Reza Aslan put out this book called Zealot, which is about the life and times of Jesus Christ. And I, being raised Roman Catholic, decided I would check this book out around Christmas time. So my memories of listening to this book are usually tied to snowstorms, because I was driving around like shoveling a lot of my family members' driveways while listening to this book. But this is a scenario where it's read by the author, which is another thing that happens from time to time. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And in this case, it very much does.
I listened to this one too. And I actually met Reza Aslan at Wayne State University. He talked, and it wasn't a surprise to me that he did a good job, because at his talk where the organization I was involved in like booked him, he was very fluid, and he's good on TV, all of that. A very kind of funny like reference to this in the audiobook listener world about people who can't read their own books is Thomas Harris, who wrote the Hannibal Lecter books.
Sounds of Lambs.
First one, which is Manhunter, there's 2 versions, but you can find one where he read it, and it's not great.
Oh, no.
He's just, you know, I think people get married to the way that phrases should be said and all that, instead of realizing that they were also done in the early 80s when the sound production existed. They just weren't dedicating it to audiobooks. And I think that has had a huge impact too. A lot of times people saw audiobooks as just tools for people whose vision was impaired.
Right.
And so they're just like, instead of thinking of those as readers and pleasing those people, they're just, we just say the words.
Yeah.
In fact, here's another dark fact. Ed Kemper, who is a pretty intense serial killer named the Co-Ed Killer, he did, as part of a prison project, he read books for the blind. So you can find audiobooks read by Ed Kemper out in the world.
Post being caught.
Yes,
which
from
is
prison.
Morbid to think about.
It's morbid.
This is a man who has killed people.
Yeah.
And you're listening to him.
I guess it's a good service and it sort of doesn't matter, but that's a really scary thing to think about, that guy's voice in your ears, you know, telling you whatever story. Yeah.
I have the perfect segue to lighten that up, and it still ties into being read by the author. If anyone asks me actually what my favorite audiobook is, it is Born Standing Up, the autobiography of Steve Martin, read by the author. Just delightful. I mean,
bet that's great.
It's just fantastic. You get to learn.
He's a performer, you know, so I think that makes a big difference. If you're just an author that sits in a room all day and writes a book, like, I don't think Stephen King would ever be like, I'm going to read my book.
Right.
But, you know, you've got all, you know, comedians who read their memoirs.
Yep.
I've listened to like Tina Fey's.
Oh, yeah.
Hers was funny. Even like My Favorite Murder, they're podcasters. So, of course, they read their own audiobook.
Of course.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, man.
Another like kind of way that I think a lot of people listen to audiobooks is like on road trips.
Yeah.
I have a really good story about one of those. I randomly decided to go to Ogden, Kansas, where my grandfather was born, just like on a whim. It's 15 and a half hours away from here. Like,
oh, sure.
Yeah, one way.
That's a book.
And I grabbed Outlander, which is exactly 31 hours long. So it was the whole trip. And it was good. You know, it was good. It's also very interesting to hear romantic scenes read aloud to you. It feels very embarrassing.
Yes.
If you're kind of prudish like me, I'm like, oh, I can't believe they're saying that out loud.
That's the first book is 31 hours?
Yes.
What is the author of?
Diana Gabaldon.
Diana Gabaldon, of course.
Yeah. That was a very lonesome drive over some fairly boring terrain. So it was nice to have this like world to escape into while I watched the soybean fields go by. Yeah.
I'll throw in a quick note. This is always good too. If there's a book that's like your vegetables, like I don't know, maybe it's classic literature, a book you feel like you should have read by now, and you might not feel like, and you might think that it might be kind of doldrums to get through. George Orwell's 1984. I knew I wanted to read it, didn't think I wanted to sit through it, took it down on audiobook, and actually loved it because I took it in on audiobook. Just to, yeah,
that's a good recommendation. And they're more and more, and some of them are Audible originals, and some of them end up getting released widely. There's a big push to have like some of those classics read by celebrities. So I think Alan Cumming did a reading of Dracula.
Oh boy!
So I finally read that book. And it was good because, you know, Alan Cumming's got that great, like, Scottish accent.
Oh, yeah.
You know, he's fun to listen to.
Shout out to my guy who got me through George Orwell's 1984. He is, of course, British, and he has one of the most British names ever. Simon Prebble.
Wonderful.
Simon Prebble.
Prebble.
1984. Good stuff.
Yeah, it's fun because, you know, just like any kind of reading, there's lots of different, you know, genres and stuff. Some of the early audiobooks that I really enjoyed listening to were the Janet Ivanovich, Stephanie Plum series.
Oh, yeah?
And the narrator for the first, like, 5, her name is CJ Crit. She had this kind of gravelly voice and was sarcastic. And I just I probably would not have read those books, but people seemed to think they were fun. And, I could listen to them on my drive. And she was such a fun narrator. I plowed through the first, 10 of those and felt, for me, part of working the front desk at the library is connecting with patrons about what they're, reading. And I was finding myself sort of left out. So at least once a year, I'll read like whatever the big one was. So
That's a good idea.
I can know,
Yeah.
What's the big deal about this one? And, sometimes I'm pleasantly surprised. Sometimes I'll go like, yeah, that makes sense.
Right.
Not for me, but, at least I know. And
Because
listen.
every once in a while, you field recommendations too.
Yeah.
You're not the reference desk, but someone will say, I don't know what to read. They'll just talk to you. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
You could say,
And
Lorelei.
I form connections with people who like true crime for sure, and be like, oh, check this one out.
What else is on your list?
I really loved, and this is another Stephen King. Sorry to be so like one note, but
I think horror is good for audiobooks just in general.
The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, which is like not straight horror, but it's narrated by Anne Heche, and I think I was in a really weird spot in my life. I had just broken up with somebody and still lived at home with my parents, and just to kind of get out of there, I would like drive around and I listened to this book, and it's about this little girl who's like lost in the woods, and I was just transported to that place and feeling her like loneliness but also her will to survive. It's a strange book actually for him.
That's what I've heard, is that I've heard from folks who say some variation of, I'm not really into Stephen King, but I liked this book.
Yeah. I like a lot of his stuff. He's, but this one, I don't even know why I picked it up. I grabbed it from here. I was working here at the time, and we didn't have a huge audiobook collection. So I must have just been like, all right, I'll read this. And, plugging the CDs into my CD player in my car and just trying to escape a little bit. And I love that book. I don't know if other people love it. It's kind of a minor book in his oeuvre, but the audio in particular made it a big deal for me.
Excellent.
Yeah. I guess the other thing I would say if you're a new audiobook listener to watch out for is you have to watch what tasks you do while you listen to a book. Most people, I'm assuming, are listening because they don't have time to sit down. So dishes are fine. Mm-hmm. Folding laundry is fine.
Yep.
Maybe like organizing drawers. But if you start to like do something that requires too much thinking, you'll think you're listening to the book and you're really not.
Yep.
And then you'll go, oh, I have no idea what's going on.
It has to be something that's a little rote.
Yeah.
It could be painting. Okay, so you're just going to be doing paint strokes. Or raking, you're just raking. Or you're just folding. If you're going to be checking your emails, no. Pause it. Yeah. I mean, that can happen, if you're not super into a book for whatever reason. I would just say like there's thousands and thousands and thousands of books, even if it's an audiobook. Yeah.
Just find another one. It's okay. I've abandoned so many audiobooks. My Audible list is full of like half finished books, and I'm just like, whatever. It got me through a couple hours of whatever that task was, and I have no interest in going back.
Right.
And that's okay. I think it's okay to decide that you don't like something.
Right. Anything else on your list before we go to Dan?
Oh yeah, a weird little one called 14 by Peter Clines, narrated by Ray Porter. It's just a weird little Lovecraftian, like, there's like a room or there's an apartment in this complex, and the attendees, what am I trying to say? The people who live in the apartment building.
The tenants.
Uh-huh. There we are. They all kind of band together to like combat the evil. But the narrator, Ray Porter, it's humorous. He's got voices for each of the characters, some of which have, different accents. Mm-hmm. So that's always impressive when somebody can like pull off an accent that doesn't feel like, ooh, you shouldn't have done that, mm-hmm. but also gives you like the flavor of who this person is and makes them like feel like a whole person. It's not a book I've seen talked about very much, but it was a fun.
But it still sounds like it also, fits into horror. I think there's something to be said about horror fitting nicely for audiobooks. Maybe if you're too much of a scaredy cat and you don't want to turn the page, have someone else turn the page for you.
Man, if they're scary though, that makes it worse. Like I've listened to some where I'm like, ooh. cool. You're free to like go hide under your bed because you don't have a book.
All right. Well, we're going to talk about a horror book too, because Dan John Miller has actually narrated one. So I'm going to be asking him about that. And in just a minute, we'll be joined by Dan John Miller. So stay tuned for that.
Are you there?
We're there.
We're here.
I see you guys now.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
So good to hear your voice.
Yeah.
We've been talking about how good it is to hear your voice. That's the concept. Happy Audiobook Month, Dan.
Happy Audiobook Month.
Congrats.
For those who choose to celebrate it, because a lot of people, don't like the audiobook lifestyle, and I respect them for having the difference of opinion, because it's really not for everyone, and it depends on which God you're behind and all that kind of stuff.
It's for me. It's been for me since the early 2000s. I was one of those people who would like rip audiobook CDs and then put them on an MP3 player, like anything I could do to get an audiobook in my ears.
Yeah.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
And I'm only a recent convert, so I'm happy to be here.
We haven't really accepted you, Jeff.
I know. I'm waiting for that. I'm waiting for the letter in the mail. I'm waiting for my pin.
Rip an audiobook and put it on an MP3 player from 2005, and then we can talk.
So here we were, Dan. You were a singer with a guitar in my mind, and now you're 2008, 2009. You're audiobooks. How did this happen? How did I get here, as David Byrne once said?
So let's see. How did I get into audiobooks? It was in 2008. It was just a very odd time because I remember we had just put out a Blanche album, and it was right around the whole Napster time, with like, I don't know. I mean, I think everything kind of timed out pretty similarly with like the recession, with the music industry kind of imploding, with all of a sudden it was like, nope, it's going to be turning into streaming, and there's not going to be these advances for publishing or songwriting, royalties and residuals and all that are going to be changed. So I think at that point, V2 was it V2 in America? Yeah, I think V2 in America was the label for Blanche. They went out of business, and then we had to look for another label, and we were trying to negotiate that. So it's just really trying to figure out how to make a living, doing something that you think you're good at or something you enjoy. And I was in California, I remember, and just trying to do some more acting things and songwriting. I was like, talking with some people about publishing deals. And then the writers went on strike for Hollywood. So it was like the music industry and the recession, it all seemed to kind of, hit at the same time. And I think right around that time too, Tracy and I it was a little bit after that, but because I think I'd already done one, but like our daughter, we have two kids, and we had a daughter who was born in 2009, but I guess we had probably just become pregnant. So I think it was just kind of like, all right, how are you going to keep your health insurance through the Screen Actors Guild, and probably not going to be touring, and just trying to figure out how to keep things going. So I've always been in the Screen Actors Guild mainly for voiceover, and then like some film stuff and some other things. But I was always thought that I would like doing audiobooks because I always loved doing character voices, because I always did a lot of crank calls, as we called them back in the day as a kid, before caller ID and all that. So that was always fun, and my friends and I always did that. And then just telling stories from like a perspective of like being okay with having headphones on for a long time, being in a cramped studio, and keeping your focus to tell a story and stay consistent, which I thought I could do, but I didn't really I'd never done a book or anything like that. So I just looked online really, and just started trying to figure out how to get a demo together. Then I threw Googling around, I found out that in Michigan, the largest independent audiobook publisher was in Grand Haven, Michigan, called Brilliance Audio.
Oh, yeah.
Nice.
And so Brilliance had just been bought, I think, right around then by Amazon. But it was, it was an interesting story. It was pretty cool. The guy who started the company, it was like something where he had made a bunch of money by figuring out for books on tape that he could make the cassettes. He could get twice the efficiency by having people switch from the left channel to the right channel to double the amount of time. Just kind of funny things. Then he patented that. And then, so they were always a great company. And then I hammered on them, and I got in touch with somebody who lived around here, and his name was Mel Foster. And Mel's a really great guy, and he had done a bunch of books from him. And so he put in a word for me. And I also talked to this guy, Scott Brick, who lives in Los Angeles. And Scott was really nice. And I went he invited me over to his house, and I saw his studio and his basement and stuff. And I was like, the thing I liked about Scott was seemed like my stereotypical thing was that I didn't have a beard and I wasn't like of a certain vineyard. So I was just thinking like, all right, so one thing about Scott was that he seemed to me like he was on, doing podcasts and things about audiobooks, and, just seemed to make it seem kind of cool. And then, so I just recorded a demo at my house, and through music, I knew how to do that. And then I talked to some people, and one thing they said was like, Laura Grafton, who's a friend who's from the Detroit area, she is retired now, but she was a casting person with Brilliance. And one of her things she was saying was that you hear all the time people like, I think I could do audiobooks, or people tell their friends, you have a great voice, you should do audiobooks. And she says, the first thing I tell people is sit and just try to read out loud for 3 hours. You can take breaks, but as if you're in a session, and if you don't lose your mind, then maybe you can do it, because it's really a maddening thing. And I remember going to like the Temper Mill, Dave Feeney, our good friend, Mr. Feeney, he was working on some project, and he had a bunch of us musician friends come in, and we just had to read out of a book for like a half hour. And I remember at that point going like, man, that was a lot of reading, but little did I know that it would turn into a good chunk of my life doing that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's a good point that you put up. Oh, you have a great voice. You should do audiobooks. I've experimented with just reading aloud by myself, so I'm not disturbing anybody. And within 3 paragraphs, I've already stumbled on a word or something. Yeah. Which I imagine there's always the idea that you're doing multiple takes too. So
no, you have to do it in one take. And that's the worst. Is like yesterday I got to page like 394 out of a 412 page book, and I was almost there, and I said the wrong word, so I had to start over.
Can you imagine? That would be...
Oh my gosh.
That would not be good. No.
That's a whole other thing of like, I love to read books. I should work in a library. Well, that's not exactly that.
That's right? Not all that it is. Yeah.
Well, and it's kind of like being a musician, where we used to joke about that. Like, okay, when you're on tour, especially when you're doing everything yourself, it's like, yeah, you're a musician about 10% of the time. And then about 50% of the time, you're like a truck driver.
Yep.
30% of the time, you're, I don't know, a loiterer or a
mechanic,
a mover, whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, the actual time you spend playing music or being able to work on it is not that much when you're on tour, for sure.
I'm a part-time coffee shop loiterer.
Yeah.
I'm just waiting for the bar next door to open.
Yeah.
How long are the takes usually with reading audiobooks?
You mean before I screw up?
Sure.
Well, it depends on what kind of book it is.
Yeah.
How well I've prepped it. And I remember when I started, it was before we did things on, everything's on an iPad now for a script. But before that, it was manuscripts. And I'd go through, and I'd read this thing of like, okay, for all the different characters, each character has a different colored highlighter, and just going through, and I can still, and Tracy, my wife, just remembering that, like, God, I remember the squeaking sound of your highlighters prepping a book. And then, sometimes that makes it easier when you're more prepared, but it also depends on the dialogue too. And because I think like if I'm doing a nonfiction book, And it also depends on the author too. So like 2 different nonfiction books. I remember doing one on Otis Redding that I was so excited to do, and reading it. Once I started narrating it, it was like, man, there's just a lot of, I don't know if you want to call them $3 words or whatever, but it was just like
perspicacious.
Yeah.
And it's just like, there's got to be a simpler way to say that. And the guy was a good writer, but it was just like, for a book about Otis Redding, it just didn't seem like it was exactly right. And it was just really hard and laborious to get through. To get into a flow, I think, is the real thing. But the thing I like doing the best, I think, is dialogue. Like, I love doing 2-person dialogue scenes, especially if there's an argument. And then I think that's when I lose myself into the characters the most, and and just not even thinking about it. And right now, a lot of times I have a home studio and I'll work with like a director from New York, and it'll be over the internet, and they'll go back and forth. But at Brilliance, especially, we'd have 3 people, and it would be the narrator, the director who had read the book, the narrator who had hopefully read the book, and then the engineer who had not read the book. So it was great because the engineer gave it objectivity. So if you were giving something away or doing something, you could always ask the engineer, and they'd have some objective opinion because they didn't know what was going to happen, especially if it was mystery or suspense or anything like that. But I remember doing some books with like a Philip Roth book that was really great. And I just remember getting into some scenes where it was just back and forth, and it felt like therapy, where it was just like I think that is the most fun thing for me about audiobooks and narrating them, is that if it's really great, it's therapeutic, and it's just bizarre to do multiple characters. And when you can really feel those multiple characters, especially if there's like 2 characters arguing, and I swear, like in that book, and I've had it, it doesn't happen all the time, but it's like you're having an argument with your conscience, you're just like, because you're trying your best to be authentic to each character, and they're arguing with each other, and one of them's going to end up winning. And even if you prepped it and you know who's going to win, you still got to fight for that. So it's kind of fun. And then once in a while, like if I'm working with a director or something, they'll be like, that was really good. Like, that felt pretty good, And then there's other times where you're like, you think you've done a pretty good job, and the director or somebody will be like, all right, and it's just like, that's all I get. And then
we're good.
The hardest thing is, I think, is when you're recording by yourself and directing yourself, which is a big thing now because of budgets and everything, and you just don't get any feedback. So you're just like, it felt good, but you don't know if it was really good or authentic or whatever. So
I can imagine just the little bit of work I've done with Jeff on the podcast and stuff, going back and editing, like I would get sick of the sound of my own voice if I was directing myself. Like, is that good? I don't know if that's good. Oh no. Like, and having this, existential crisis. Do you find if you've directed yourself, you're like, oh my God, will you just shut up? I don't want to hear me anymore.
Dan, I'm not sick of my own voice. This is a safe space for you to say you're not sick of your own voice.
I love my voice.
I love it.
I remember going to New York for some audiobook event, like a convention and awards show when I first started doing it, and hearing somebody like at some panel, talk about, when I go back and I listen to I'm just like, God, how can you do that? Like, it's the last thing I want to hear is my voice, and I never really want to listen back, musically. I don't know. I mean, there's some, for a performance or whatever, there's some weird narcissism, I guess, if you do something well and it feels good. But I like hearing if it's humorous or odd character voices, but when it's just regular narration, it's me, I always think it sounds pretty bland. Like, I wouldn't listen to that guy.
And then one quick note, I don't know if it's too highfalutin. We haven't used this terminology, but you say you are reading audiobooks, you're narrating. This is really acting. This is performance. Because it's funny, even like from a credit perspective, like when you do I know Brilliance Audio, for example, I'm doing a book for them right now. And when I recorded the intro, it was, whatever, you say the title and then you say, performed by Dan John Miller, whatever. Right.
And some are like read by,
Right.
and it all, it all depends. And I think it can get heavy-handed, and I know I've done it, and it depends on the publisher, and it depends on what the author wants. If they want you to get pretty big with character voices, and then there's some authors where even if they describe, an Irish lilt or a rasp, they're like, no, we don't want to hear any of that.
Wow.
But
Interesting.
you're describing it. It seems like, and if I can do it, I mean, I can do it subtly, but sometimes they don't want that. And then there's other times I think where it can, it depends on, I think everybody has their own taste for it too. And I know when I checked out from the library a bunch of audiobooks before I got into it, when I was going to get put together an audio reel, for auditions and stuff like that. I got them. And then Tracy, my wife, like I was asking her, so what did you think? And although we're usually lockstep with music and films and stuff, we were not that way with audio. She's like, really? Oh. You like that guy? I just thought it was too choppy, or this and that, or this woman sounded too this, so we both had, so I think it can depend on the listener, like what, so I think a lot of people, when they find someone they like, they tend to stick with it. And there's some narrators who are great, who do almost no character voices. And there are some narrators who do great character voices who I don't think are very good audiobook narrators, because it just doesn't feel like they're telling a story, because it becomes more about a performance as opposed to conveying, the story that the author wants. And I'm sure I've gone over the top, and people, have listened, and, and I think one of the things that was weird was like for women to do men's voices for fiction and for men to do women's voices, so it does seem better to not do, I mean, obviously nothing falsetto or anything like that, but also not to, to tell it more like if I was talking to you guys and I said, I ran up to Kroger and the cashier said, hey, you don't, I wouldn't be like,
yeah.
And the cashier said, hey, I need you to,
Right.
But it's also very fun to do, like when they always say to have the most fun with smaller characters, so it's, and I think the other really cool thing about narrating audiobooks is most of the time you have almost total creative control when it comes to fiction. So if somebody's not described a certain way, you can kind of take it and do whatever you want and give somebody, so if you're thinking this person should have a little bit of a rasp or a nasal thing, or, so you can, I mean, there's the tone of the voice, there's the speed of how quickly they talk. There's, the tempo of it. It is very musical. So it's kind of fun to do that stuff. And then it all depends on how much the author wants you to, to get behind it. But that, you were asking me about the first book I did, which was, I was in California and I got this call from Brilliant saying, they wanted me to do this Andre debut book, who had written House of Sand and Fog, and his next one was called Garden of Last Days, and they wanted me to do it. And I had never done a book before, so they said, oh, we needed to start, and I'm like, I'm in California, so we'll get you on the next one. But I really loved House of Sand and Fog and wanted to do it, so I was like, well, let me see if I can change my flight. So I took a red eye, and then I got in that morning, drove to Grand Haven, and started recording, around noon or something that day, and I was just so tired. And there's a bunch of Arabic things that I didn't know, for dialects with apostrophes and having to kind of do this little jump to your voice. And I fortunately had a great director and narrator, and they were very patient with me. And I just kept drinking a ton of water, and it was a long book. I think it was like 16 hours long. And when it was done, I'm sure if I listened to it now, I'd be kind of mortified because I didn't know what the hell I was doing. But it was really fun. And, and the big thing was, after I got through that first day, they all said like, oh, no, you can do this. Like some people. And I remember the night before I left was because I had a small part in a movie called Leatherheads with, with George Clooney, and he directed it and was in it, and John Krasinski and Renee Zellweger, and then Jonathan Pryce was in it. And the scene I did was with Jonathan Pryce, and he was just like, he was telling me, he's like, I'm trying to do an audiobook, and after about 20 minutes, I had to walk out. I was done because, you can't just, because he was such a great theatrical stage actor and trained that way, I think. And for whatever reason, I can just sit there and I can get really into it. I think, it feels like it, but and I think part of it maybe is from having done a lot of home recording with music.
I was going to guess.
You really cannot make any big movements. I mean, anytime I do is if I start getting into some scene, inevitably you hit some, the filter on the mic or something, or your chair creaks or something. It's like, oh,
yeah, you're probably statuesque the whole time, not even moving.
My posture is excellent.
Yeah.
There was another book though that was, I think, hopefully an interesting story, but it was an American tragedy written in 1920 or something like that. And it was, the movie A Place in the Sun. Mm-hmm. That's a little excerpt of an American tragedy. This classic of American literature, just like a fantastic book, but just filled with the writing at that time, just one parenthetical phrase after another, just the longest sentences. And it was almost like every sentence was filled with a disclaimer, but it was so emotional and such a beautiful book and so sad and funny and, just everything, it's why it's such a well-regarded book, but probably not the best thing or the easiest thing for an audiobook. And the publisher I was doing it with had some system at that point where you held almost like this Game Boy thing or something. It was like a video control thing. And they would send you, so you wouldn't record on Pro Tools, which is what I usually do if I'm recording at home. But so they sent you their computer that had this kind of thing that would highlight the text, and it was like playing a video game. So when you'd finish a paragraph, you had to hit something, then it would jump ahead.
Wow, weird.
And that really was, if you would get to the end of a really long paragraph and screwed up, you had to start that whole thing again. It was just awful. But it was right before, and I remember it was right before my son was born, and I was like, well, it's a 36-hour book, but I love this book and I'm going to do it.
Wow.
And I was recording it at a friend's house in the basement that was empty, but it was near some railroad tracks in Royal Oak, and I had to time it when the trains wouldn't come by and stuff. But the worst thing was that it turned out there was some problem with their program or the equipment they had sent me. So I think I probably recorded that book twice. It just took forever. And then it kept, it's like any other technical thing, but I remember some scenes like where it sounds so pitiful, but I was like in the basement of this vacant house recording this book, and it'd be this dialogue or something, and this guy's kind of like pleading, the character's pleading for his life, but he's very manipulative and all this. And I remember just loving it. And I would get to the point, like when you're really feeling something and, just tearing up and just like, man, this feels really good. And then all of a sudden it would crap out.
Oh, no.
Like, all right. So I got to redo that whole thing. And, and it's like just doing another take in a film, I guess, or something like that. But it was just something about it was just so unfair. But it turned out good and people liked it. But
so what I'm
just I think we've come a long ways in the old audiobook industry.
Yeah. What I'm getting from this is if you encounter someone who says, I really like reading, I should read audiobooks, you're going to throttle their collar and say, do you really like reading?
Yeah, I think you really have to. And I think that's like,
really
from what I've heard, some people, and it'll happen with authors too, who think they can do it, and then they'll be like, never again. I will never do that. It was maddening. And the sad thing is like I talked to a speech pathologist or somebody at one point, and I remember she was telling me, she's like, especially at Brilliance, like they would have us go like from 9 a.m. till 5 p.m. all day, and like other publishers did not want you doing it because they felt like you would hit a certain point and then your voice wouldn't be as sharp, and mentally you wouldn't be doing as well. But everybody has their own way of going about things. But she was saying that she's like, even if you take a break every hour and take really great care, it's the equivalent of running a marathon every day. And the greatest, most in shape marathon runners are still exhausted after running a marathon. So you're going to be exhausted every day. And so that was the thing, like at Brilliance would go to the hotel after, and at first you're just like, this is great, I'm in Grand Haven, it's summertime, and I'm going to go out to the lighthouse and go get a pronto pup and do this and that. And sometimes I'd get the energy to do it, but a lot of times after reading all day, you just want to go back to the hotel room and just look at some stupid movie or TV show and just veg out, not think about anything. So.
Yeah.
We should change June to Audiobook Narrator Appreciation Month.
Yes.
There you go.
Because where will we be without you? We really appreciate all the efforts of audiobook narrators.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do think that is the number one thing is like, if you're going to be an audiobook narrator and you want to do it, I think it's really a love of the books, and really conveying a story or a subject, because one of the coolest things I think is that there are just so many books that I've narrated that there's no way I would have ever chosen to read, and it's like the same thing with music, it's kind of like the magic of listening to something that's curated by someone you don't know, or radio, and just the like being open to it, like, man, I can't believe that. What the hell was that song, or that sound, or that arrangement? Whereas like if you're in control and you're just going through everything and just picking it, you're really not going to be that surprised. So it's kind of fun to be thrown in the water sometimes and just like read just something that you would never think would be interesting, in the same way that there are some books I've thought I would love and it wasn't that good,
Oh yeah.
Or even like some authors you wouldn't expect to be there's a guy, I've read a couple of his books. He's like a physicist, really, and I did one book of his. He was a good friend of Stephen Hawking's, and he wrote a memoir about his friendship with Stephen Hawking. And then the last one I did of his was about just emotions and how they tie into the way we think, and just different things, the newest brain chemistry science and how everything works and the changes. And in both those cases, I just thought this is going to be pretty dry, but he's just a great writer at telling a story, and I think that's the number one thing. You're trying to pretend like you're talking to one person, telling a friend the story. And I think that's one of the reasons some actors aren't happy about doing it, because they're really not performing for an audience, and it's just like for yourself almost, or for one person, and it's got to be pretty intimate and soft, unless it's an argument.
Yeah.
Dan, thanks so much for joining us and rapping with us about audiobooks. Really appreciate the chance to pick your brain.
Yeah.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you for your work. Thank you for your voice. Keep taking care of your voice. Remember to hydrate, or whatever. Honey and tea and shall. Yeah. I feel like we'll link to your Audible credits in the show notes. Go listen to a book by Dan John Miller. And Dan, thanks again. Happy Audiobook Month.
All right. Thank you, guys. Happy Audiobook Month to you and yours.
Take care, sir.
Thank
All
you.
right. See you guys. Bye.
Bye.
That was Dan John Miller. And that's our episode. We should have more guests on. Kelly, it was great to have you on here as always.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to talk to somebody who does a thing I truly appreciate.
Oh, man, all the patience. You have been listening to A Little Too Quiet, the Ferndale Library podcast. It's brought to you by the Friends of the Ferndale Library. We were joined by Dan John Miller, who you just heard. We were also joined by Kelly.
Bye.
And you were joined by me too. And the music that you hear at the beginning and end of each episode is by a local musician, John Duffy. If you want to support this podcast, go to ferndalefriends.org or rate or review or follow us. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it to social media or just tell a friend about it. And happy Audiobook Month. We'll be back next week with more. Thanks for listening.